Satan, Satanism, Demonism, and Exorcism. Chapter 2, Satan's Empire. How graphically the prophet, Isaiah 14:13 and 14, describes the various features of his ambition. Thou hast said in thine heart, 1. I will ascend into heaven, I will make myself an exalted ruler. 2. I will exalt my throne above the stars, angels. Job 38:7, of God, I will become the king over the angels. Matthew 12:24. 3. I will sit also upon the mount, kingdom. Daniel 2:35, 44 and 45, Isaiah 25:6, of the congregation, people. I will become the ruler of the human family, in the sides of the north, as spiritual, invisible ruler. 4. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will put myself out of reach of all trouble. 5. I will be like the Most High, I will found an independent empire in which as God's rival I will be supreme, and will be his equal. Yes, he has founded an empire having two phases, 1, an invisible phase, consisting of the fallen angels under his leadership, as the higher and controlling phase of his empire, and, 2, a visible and subordinate phase, consisting of 3 departments, oppressive governments, predatory aristocracies and false religions, as the visible representatives of the invisible and ruling fallen angels among men. The earthly phase of his empire has 3 classes of representatives corresponding respectively to its 3 departments, rulers, aristocrats and clergy, who are the officials in these 3 departments. Satan's divine right errors. Satan has set forth the principle of the divine right, as the foundation principle of his empire, and has given this principle in 3 forms, the divine right of rulers, the divine right of aristocrats, and the divine right of the clergy, one form of the principle of the divine right for each department of his empire. These 3 forms of the doctrine of the divine right were calculated, to make the masses blindly subject to the classes as a matter of divine sanction and obligation. How well, the 3 forms of the divine right were calculated to keep the masses, indoctrinated with the error of the divine right, in subjection to Satan's representatives, and thus to him, becomes manifest on even a casual consideration of what the 3 forms of this principle mean. By the doctrine of the divine right of kings, Satan caused the following thoughts to be taught by his mouthpieces, especially by the clergy. 1. The kings are God's direct appointees, vicegerents and representatives. 2. They do exactly what God wants them to do. 3. Therefore God sanctions all their acts, which means, for example, God sanctions all the acts of the Tsar and the Kaiser. 4. Therefore the people are in duty bound to obey without question everything their rulers require. The principle of the divine right of rulers was calculated to keep the people subject to those rulers on whose selfishness Satan could depend to advance those governmental policies that he wished advanced, and thus he would control the people governmentally by the divine right doctrine. By the doctrine of the divine right of the aristocrats, he caused the following things to be taught, especially through the clergy. 1. It is the divine goodwill and pleasure that practically the whole earth and its riches be owned and administered by the aristocrats. 2. That these act as the stewards and almoners of the Almighty, in dispensing on their own terms to the bulk of mankind, as their slaves, serfs or employees, of the surplus of earth's bounties. 3. That God sanctions the aristocrats' administration of things, and 4. That the masses should, therefore, be content with their lot and with what is dispensed to them by these stewards and almoners of the Almighty. The principle of the divine right of the aristocrats was calculated to keep the people subject as slaves, serfs or employees, to the aristocrats, on whose selfishness Satan could depend to advance those aristocratic policies that he wanted advanced, and thus he would control the people economically and socially by the divine right doctrine. By the doctrine of the divine right of the clergy, Satan caused, especially by the clergy, the following thoughts to be taught. 1. God speaks to the people through the clergy. 2. Therefore they are his mouthpieces giving forth the truth. 3. He sanctions their teachings and, 4. Therefore the people should with blank, unquestioning minds believe and practice the clergy's teachings. The principle of the divine right of the clergy, was calculated to make the people subject to the clergy, on whose selfishness Satan could depend to advance those religious teachings and practice that he wanted advanced, and thus he would control the people religiously by the divine right doctrine. Of course, the doctrine of the divine right as Satan has caused it to be taught is false as a whole and in its three forms, but it has been calculated to keep the race subject to Satan since the flood, until very recent times, when the war debates largely set it aside throughout Christendom. Satan's cunning manipulations. For the good of his empire, Satan has always seen to it that, compatibly with the successful operation of his empire's three earthly departments, some law and order existed, for he was too shrewd to allow anarchy to reign in his kingdom, well knowing it would result in wreck and ruin for his cause. Hence there has from the outstart been in his empire civil law, guarding especially the rights of the leaders in state, religion and aristocracy, or, as it is now usually called, capital. This has prevented anarchy from setting in among such rulers. And only then has he tolerated the setting aside of civil law when it interfered with such overturning of governments, religions and aristocracies as he decided should be overturned for his empire's good. Also, Satan has introduced some laws for the regulation of the rights of the common people. These, however, have always been made first of all to serve the interests of the statesmen, clergy and aristocrats, and subordinately to such interests they have been made to serve those interests of the common people that were calculated to keep them subject first of all to his own interests and thereafter to prosper in a measure their interests, and that, again, subject to his dominion as the executioner of the race, Hebrew 2:14. These limitations have always made his governments, religions and aristocracies oppressive and exploitative of the common people, and have allowed more or less of crime and other invasions of the common people's rights, which Satan on general principles encouraged in individual cases, partly because it was in his interests to corrupt the race and partly to arrange for the execution of penalties on exceptional cases, in order to strike fear into the hearts of the people, as a tribute of respect to his laws. Thus he has been an angel of both light and darkness, accordingly as it best served his ends. 2 Corinthians 11:14 and 15. Supporting doctrines of Satan's empire. An empire based on such principles and using such means for its perpetuation, naturally must be one of much evil, even as the scriptures call it the power of darkness, sin and error, Colossians 1:13. While he greatly deceived the people by the doctrine of the divine right of rulers, clergy and aristocrats, he knew that these of themselves were not sufficient to continue his rulership over the race. He, therefore, found it necessary to advance three other doctrines to support the superstructure which he built upon the foundation of the three forms of the divine right. We call the three above given doctrines the fundamental doctrines of Satan's empire and the following the three supporting doctrines. 1. The dead are not dead, but are alive. 2. They have become spirits and as such are conscious, and, 3. They are either in bliss or in torment. Early in the history of the race, even in Eden itself, Satan set forth these three falsehoods, for which Jesus called him a liar and the father of lies, and for whose acceptance by Eve, resulting in sin and death coming upon the race, Jesus called him a murderer, John 8:44. Note carefully the language in which Satan first clothed these three supporting errors of his empire, Genesis 3:4 and 5:1, Ye shall not surely, really, die, you will only seem to die, actually, you will live right on, even though seemingly dead, i.e., the dead are alive. 2. Ye shall be as, like the, gods, angels, Psalms 97:7, compare Hebrews 1:6. 197 times angels are called gods in the Hebrew of the Old Testament, who are spirits, Hebrew 1-7, i.e., the dead have become spirits, they exist as angels. 3. Knowing, experiencing, good, bliss, and evil, torment. Satan's design in using these three errors as the supporting doctrines of his empire is very apparent. He knew that if he could deceive the race on these three subjects, he could deceive them into believing that certain other errors were true and certain truths were false, and that certain wrongs were right and certain rights were wrong. This done, he would promise rewards for the next life to those who would, under the deception that his errors were true and his wrongs were right, accept his errors and practice his wrongs, and threaten with eternal torment those who refused so to do. So, too, would he threaten torments for the next life to those who would accept God's truths, misrepresented as erroneous by Satan, as true, and practice certain of his commands, misrepresented as wrong by Satan, as right, as he would also promise eternal bliss to those who would not so do. Thus deceivingly he would by hope of reward for compliance and by fear of torment for non-compliance, to be realized in the hereafter, enlist the people to believe and practice his errors, and he would, by misrepresentation of the source and character of God's teachings and by hope of reward and by fear of torment in the hereafter, deter the people from believing and practicing God's truths. Thus he would enslave the race to his will and prevent their doing God's will. In this dark plot, he succeeded with the bulk of the human family, 2 Corinthians 4:4, Corinthians 11:3, 14 and 15, 2 Thessalonians 2:9, 2 Timothy 2:26. Thus by the three errors under consideration, he mightily supported his empire and its foundation errors on the divine right. The Kingdom of Darkness. The above considerations show us that Satan's empire is founded on and supported by errors. And by these, he has worked mightily in the hearts of the children of disobedience throughout the duration and territory of his empire, Ephesians 2:2. But an empire so founded and so supported must be an evil one, even as all history attests, for the course of Satan's empire is marked by every evil word and work. Corrupt indeed have been the majority of the rulers, aristocrats and clergy of his empire. The history of the present evil world, Galatians 1:4, presents a succession of events replete with war, revolution, rapine, murder, destruction, lust, cruelty, conquest, oppression, degradation, unhappiness, misfortune, death, and persecution, especially of God's people. How little space is given in history to good, noble and elevating philanthropies. How much of its space is given to their opposites. So, too, Satan's empire has been one in which are found the greatest inconsistencies. How contradictory have been its religions, its philosophies, its civilizations, its governments, its social arrangements, its laws and its workings. Satan's use of ignorance and superstition. From this, we infer that Satan adapts the form of government, religion, society, etc., to the varying ideals of the peoples as far as he must. He would, if he could, keep all people in the densest ignorance, deepest oppression, darkest superstition and basest character and environment, but when the people will no longer stand for this, he makes such concessions as he must, compatibly, however, with his retaining control. This will account for the many overthrowals, revolutions and reorganizations that have occurred in the governmental, aristocratic and religious departments of his empire. Whenever the various governments, aristocracies and religions, which he has used cease to serve his purpose of controlling the people, as nearly according to his views as possible, he wrecks those governments, aristocracies or religions, often with extreme ruthlessness, and replaces them by others more in harmony with his aims, and the concessions he must make to his subjects. He certainly makes it uncomfortable, for those rulers or religionists, who oppose the principles and purposes of his empire. This is manifest in the oppositions and persecutions that he has aroused against every Christian leader and movement that have attacked his errors and preached God's truth, for he has made them his special targets. When we look upon the physical, mental, moral and religious perfection in which God created the human family in Eden, and then by contrast consider the physical, mental, moral and religious wrecks which Satan has made of so many of our race, we have one of the most striking evidences of his wicked character as a person and as a ruler, of the conspicuous failure of his empire as a means of blessing its subjects, and of the crying need of his and its displacement by the Christ as the ruler and the kingdom of God as the empire, in order to rescue the human race from utter ruin and destruction, and to return it to the original perfection and bliss of God's image and likeness. After mankind's fall into sin, God intimated such a consummation, Genesis 3:15, he renewed and amplified this to Abraham. By the types of the law he repeatedly emphasized it. In the sublime poetry of the prophets and psalmists he reiterated it. Through Jesus and his apostles he clearly expounded it. He encourages his faithful people to offer for it the prayer, "Thy kingdom come," and by the signs of the times he indicates it as at hand. It is the desire of, as it will prove to be the cure for, all the nations. God speed the day of the overthrow of Satan's empire and of the establishment of his kingdom under the whole heaven.